As sports history fans, we often reminisce about the legends. Willis Reed limping onto the NBA Finals court, Kurt Schilling's bloody sock, Kerry Strug's courageous dismount, and so many more. These moments often define sports history. But what about the countless injuries that did not become legends, or careers that were derailed due to inadequate care? That's where this episode's sponsor comes in. Introducing to you, ILP Sports Consultants, your trusted sports injury partner, available 24/7. Brian Maelli at ILP Sports Consultants has over 20 years of experience in the orthopedic and sports medicine industry, and he has worked with athletes across the gamut, from youth to amateurs, professionals, in almost every sport played in the United States of America, accommodating athletes at every stage of their career. This adaptability ensures that ILP services are perfectly tailored to your skill level, no matter where you are in your athletic journey. With ILP, you are in control. Choose the steps that matter most to you. Diagnosis, treatment plan, recovery, or the whole journey. ILP services are tailored to your unique needs. Rushing for care is a common pitfall, leading to future problems. ILP Sports Consultants helps you make the right decisions, ensuring that you receive timely and safe care. And here's a bonus. Brian hosts the Injured List podcast, sharing insights and athlete stories you won't want to miss. Whether you're a concerned parent or grandparent, or an athlete yourself seeking guidance, ILP Sports Consultants is your beacon of hope in sports injury management. Visit ilpsports.com today. That's the letters ilpsports.com. ILP Sports Consultants, where your well-being is the priority and your recovery is the mission. Choose ILP Sports Consultants for a healthier sports journey, helping you get back in the game the smart way.
This is Craig Colquitt, former punter for the University of Tennessee Volunteers and the Pittsburgh Steelers, and you are listening to Total Sports Recall Podcast, a part of Sports History Network. Now, here is your host, Harv Aronson.
I'm your host, Harv Aronson, and for this episode, I bring in a gentleman that's partly responsible for helping this show get off the ground. He's also in charge of the network for which this podcast is a part of. I would like to introduce Arnie Chapman. Established in 2020, the Sports History Network, in Arnie's words, was created to be the home field advantage for podcasters of sports from the past. According to Arnie, podcasters through the Sports History Network can take advantage of shared resources and other benefits. The Sports History Network provides multiple forms of membership options to its podcasters that will fit into each podcaster's needs and expected outcomes of the network. Arnie's also the host of his own podcast titled The Football History Dude. His show is dedicated to teaching NFL fans about the history of professional football. When he's not podcasting, he's drinking the blue Kool-Aid as a Detroit Lions fan, and that's not just this year. He's lived in Honolulu blue and silver his whole life. Welcome to the show, Arnie, and I must begin by giving you a big thank you for advising me on podcasting, directing me to purchase the right equipment, signing me up for the best podcasting apps. And I'm sure I'm not the first podcaster you've helped get off the ground, correct?
Well, first off, thanks for having me, Harv. Yes, I do drink the blue Kool-Aid, and that is not just this year. That is my whole life. I'm a true blood, born and raised in the Michigan area, and I have gone through a lot of more downs than ups throughout my whole life. But as far as the podcast goes, no, you're not the first one that I've worked with. It's something that actually I found that I enjoy more of the podcast and helping people start their shows than anything. And we'll probably get into that later in the episode.
Sure. And when you talk about the Detroit Lions, I'm sure you've seen Crackman around.
Crackman. Oh, I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to look this up. What's Crackman?
Yeah. He's when I won the Visa Hall of Fans award and got up to the Hall of Fame, and that's a story for another day. But he also won the award for the Detroit Lions, and he's a nut. He wears like these cut-off farmer jeans, a hard hat, and he's a diehard Lions fan. So I'm sure if you look him up, you'll recognize him when you see him. But yeah, he's
Yep.
in the
No,
Hall of
now
Fame.
that you say that, I'm looking him up right now. I see him.
Yeah. He's a funny guy. Oh, he is just a riot. So, but diehard Lions fan. So, for those who are out there who might be listening that want to start a podcast, so what would your initial advice be to somebody that might say, "Hey, I want to do a podcast too"?
I mean, the first thing, of course, we always say is, well, just start, because people tend to get nervous. Okay, let's me take it back a little bit. The first thing that everyone always says is, who am I, the imposter syndrome, to be on a podcast and be out there and telling people, the world, like what I think? Who am I other than, this person sitting in my room, that kind of thing. But even like a guy like Tom Hanks even talks about imposter syndrome, one of the probably greatest actors of all time, if not the greatest actor of all time, of not thinking he's really worthy of having the role that he has. And so that's the first thing. The next thing that you always hear people talk about is, I don't like the sound of my voice. I just don't hear it. And the thing is, when, not to get too sciencey on you, but there's some kind of thing that makes it so we hear our voice differently than what. So Harv is listening to my voice right now, and I sound different to you than I sound to myself, because when I hear myself talking, it's vibrating through my skull. So there's some kind of like reverberance or something like that. And I don't know what it is, but like that's the first thing, is don't worry about the voice, and don't worry about people not listening to you, because even if you only have 50 downloads or 50 listeners, whatever you want to call it, within a given month or whatever, think about this. If you were at a local community library giving a speech on a topic that you're listening to, or whatever it might be, but if you're at a place and you have 50 people in a room, like, you would feel like this is pretty cool to be able to talk to 50 people. Now you have the ability to take those 50 people and maybe spread them out across the world. So don't worry about the imposter syndrome, don't worry about the not liking your own voice, and then at the end of the day, it's like, just have fun. So start with it.
Yeah, and that is true. I'm having a blast with it, and I always have that in the back of my mind too. How am I actually going to sound? Because it's true. Sometimes you don't like your own voice, and you question it. And podcasting is so popular right now. I mean, it's just, everybody's got podcasts. It's all over the place, and I actually think it's kind of put a dent in YouTube. People putting YouTube videos up. Everybody wants to do a podcast now, so it's kind of pushed YouTube back a little bit, I think. Anyway.
One of the things about that too is, to take it to the next level, if the listener's interested in jumping into that realm, before that was our avenue. Okay, you thought, I have to be on YouTube, or I have to be showing my video on all these different. The beauty of it is, if you don't like the way you look and you don't want to be on camera, podcast is just your voice. You're sitting there. Harv and I are talking right now on a Saturday morning at 10:55 a.m. It's not going to be released until whenever. If something happens, you just edit it out. You don't have to worry about like radio and live and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And there's been a few of my interviews that a couple of glitches might have happened in the process. So you have to go back and you fix it, because you certainly don't want to release that to the public. So give our listeners a little bit of background on how and why the Sports History Network got started.
I think to do that, maybe I should really go back to the origin of my first podcast. So I'm going to show you this. Harv, you get to ride in the DeLorean. So the DeLorean is something that everybody gets to ride on my podcast, which is the Football History Dude, and now the Fantasy Football Origin Stories. But I'm going to take it even back a step further. 2017-ish. So this is when I I finally finished my online schooling for the master's degree, and I had been listening to podcasts for a long time, and I really was thinking about starting one. Well, 2010, I did a podcast about my fantasy football league, but that doesn't count because there was a lot of copyright infringement. We had Michael Jackson and music on. Let's not talk about that one. But I thought I wanted to be the fantasy football dude. My wife even bought me this controller, which you can't read it right here, but it says FF Dude on it. So I was going to be the fantasy football dude, and I was going to start a fantasy football podcast back in the end of 2017 when the season was ending. And then I just kind of transitioned. I was like, man, there's so many fantasy football podcasts out there. Who am I? Again, that imposter syndrome of who would listen to me? There's the Matthew Berrys of the world. There's the fantasy footballers, all these other guys. So I just kind of really got into I got in my head, I guess you could say, but then I was like, I really want to start this show still. I really like the NFL is my number one passion, and then history in general, not just sports history. I just love history all around. So I started looking to see if there was any football history podcasts. At the time, there were some not super dedicated. Some of them were dead podcasts that had started like 5 years previously, maybe by the NFL Network, 8 episodes, shut down, that kind of thing. So I decided I was going to start what I ultimately called the Football History Dude Show. And the reason for that people always ask is, why'd you call it the Football History Dude? Well, I don't know. Part of it's because I'm the dude. Okay, so the football history dude part, football history is obvious. I wanted to have, and this is a tip for the listener of the show, try to get something in the name of your podcast that describes what the show is going to be about. So football history. I couldn't say NFL history because I didn't want copyright infringement, but the dude part was because kind of almost an homage to my grandpa. We may get into that later, but like, he's the reason why we're Lions fans. He's the reason why we're football fans in general. But like, he would call us, "Hey dude," and stuff like that all the time. So it was kind of like in our family ingrained. And somehow I knew I wanted the word dude in there because I wanted to come across the fact that this show is not going to be just strictly, I'm not reading like the guy from Clear Eyes. And then back in 1867, Walter Camp started. I wanted to let him know that it was going to be like kind of a fun show, but at the same time, it's serious about like getting the facts right. So that's kind of where it started. That podcast happened. I was a solo ship, we'll call it, where it was just me on the mic, super nervous, like I talked about earlier. I even had the microphone upside down for my first episode, so it sounded like I was in a wind tunnel. I had a really bad, and I talked about Walter Camp, the father of American football, and just had a bullet list. I was really, for lack of better terms, I forced it because I thought I had to be humorous. I wasn't genuine, maybe is the best word to put it. So I slowly started to get into like the solo episodes. Flash forward to 2019-ish, around March, a guy named Upton Bell reaches out. And Upton Bell, if in the football, not now, but back in the day, that name, the Bell family, was really critical to sport. Actually, to Pittsburgh, too, to the terrible towel. So, Bert Bell half-owned. So, Bert Bell, Upton is Bert Bell's son.
No way.
Upton was part of the Colts organization for a long time when Unitas was there and Carol Rosenblum. Actually, when Bert Bell passed away, do you know the story about how Bert Bell passed away as the commissioner while his two former teams were... Okay, so Bert Bell founded the Eagles, actually, with his wife and everything. And then he was also kind of part owner of the Steelers, and they got together as the Steagles for that year. So because he was kind of part owner of each, and then when he went in to be the commissioner, possibly the first great commissioner of the NFL, there was a time, it was right before, I want to say it was the 58 season. There was a game where the Steelers and the Eagles were playing each other, and it was in I can't remember. I think it was in Philadelphia. But at that game, as his one former team threw a touchdown to basically almost win the game against his other former team, in the stands, he had a heart attack, passed away.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and Upton tells a story. He was running across the field because he was a high school or a college basketball player and all this stuff. But at any rate, he reaches out because I had previously done an episode on Bert Bell's legacy because he was part of the inaugural Hall of Fame class and all that kind of thing. So he goes, and this is a phone. I got my iPhone right here. So he leaves a phone message and says, "Hey, you did it." And this guy's like 90 years old at this point.
Oh, no
you
kidding.
did an episode on my father, blah, blah, blah. I really liked it. I think you should have me on your show. And first off, I'm like, Upton Bell, what is an Upton Bell? I don't know who this name is. So I had to do some Google research. Come to find out, I wish I would have known this story was coming up, but there's a book up there. Yeah. He sends me the book called Creation of the NFL, present at the creation, because he was there, as a baby. He was born not too long after they founded the Eagles. He was babysat by some of the great Eagles in past. I'm losing sight. Who's the 46? Who is the champ? Who's the quarterback of the champion Eagles back in the 40s?
Oh my gosh,
I'm losing sight. Anyway, but yeah, he was like his babysitter, just these crazy stories. And then he goes into the Colts organization. Carol Rosenblum, who was the owner of the Colts, a lot of people don't like him. But anyway, so he took him in after this because he was they had an agreement that the Eagles were going to be gifted to Upton Bell not too long thereafter, but everything fell through. So he took him in the organization. He was a scout for him. He ended up becoming, in 74, the youngest at that time general manager of the Boston Patriots, who then turned into the New England Patriots, so on and so forth. He owned a team in the WFL, the Charlotte, whatever they were called back then. So he's been around all sorts of stuff. And so he's able to and he was there at ESPN, Harvard. He was all that type, like an announcer. So he reaches out. He's like, hey, I'd like to come on your show and, talk about your my father and his story because I really like what you're doing there. Never
Wow.
even considered being an interviewer. I was super nervous. I was like, okay, what do I do? So he sends me the book. And that story is even crazy too, because the book gets sent by his publicist, but it goes to this like little podunk tiny town post office because they had the wrong zip code or something. I'm waiting for like 3 weeks for this book to come because I'm nervous to read it and then to get stories or questions, all that stuff. So anyway, I finally get the book. I read it. I probably read it like 3 times, write all these questions down. And then at that time, I'm like super nervous to interview. So I'm writing, he tells a story and he's the really good storyteller. Like you gotta go, oh, his mom was rolling with Al Capone back in the day. Like she was like the number one like movie actress. And, yeah. Like there's like this story, you can't make these stories up. Some of the stuff that he tells you. And, so I got through that interview and I kind of really enjoyed it. So promise you, this leads into the Sports History Network. I end up deciding at that point, I'm like, somebody reached out to me. And again, this goes to the listener of the show, thinking that nobody's really listening. A big name in the industry that maybe people don't know now because everyone thinks that the NFL started after the Super Bowl started. But back then, so he reaches out, we have an interview. And then from there, I decide to start doing more interviews. And then it actually turned into the past 3.5 years, whatever, I've only done interviews. I really don't do solo episodes anymore. But through that experience, one of the guys that I ended up interviewing was Joe Ziemba and Joe Zagorski, 2 members of our podcast network right now. Sure. And as we were talking, they're both authors. One is an author more for like Chicago football history, and then the other one is kind of more just specifically 70s football. Had a really good conversation. They both are very well spoken. They both have experience speaking in public, blah, 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 blah. But neither one of them are really technologically savvy when it comes to like the podcast space. Again, another thing that the listener of the show, if you're interested in starting a podcast, the hurdle is the technology, the voice, and the imposter syndrome. The technology can be overcome with a little bit of just understanding and just sit back and just have a chance to be able to work through it. With these 2 guys, we decided, well, let's start. I told them, if you want to start a podcast, maybe I could help you. This is Joe Ziemba first. This is like November of 2019. And then I brought him on again in 2020. Joe Zagorski, I have him on in March of 2020, I think it was. And I told him the possibility of starting a podcast. Not more than a day after we released his episode, he messages me back. I really like doing that. I listen to the episode. How do I start that podcast you're talking about? I'm like, well, okay, let's look into it. And then for some reason, somehow Joe Zagorski, so there's Ziemba also at the same time was like, let's start a podcast. So the Joe Z's I always refer to as the guys, the founding fathers of the Sports History Network. Sure. So I started their podcast. I did the producing, the editing, all that other stuff. And then we released, even though Joe Zagorski reached out first, we released his trailer episode technically first. And then the real first episode was Memorial Day of 2020, Mott's Tonelli. I'm sitting not more than 15 feet from my little barn shed for Joe Ziemba, Mott's Tonelli, who was a war hero for the Chicago Cardinals. And I just sat there when I'm filling up my gas in my lawnmower, not 15 feet from here, and I'm listening to his episode, the first ever episode released on the Sports History Network that was not the Football History Dude, tearing up because I was like, man, this is cool. Somebody else's show is on a network that I helped create, and then now people can listen to it. And both of their shows are, in my opinion, vastly superior to mine, especially when it comes to like the amount of work that goes into creating each episode. I kind of free flow as far as I talk to the guests. I do some research, but I want to kind of be like we're at the bar. They put in so much effort into writing the article. It's like a production when we put on their episodes. And then from there, it just kind of just kept going. I had some people reach out. I got to give Darren Hayes big kind of credit because he reached out and he said, hey, I'm going to put an episode out every day. I'm like, you're nuts, dude.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, like
my interview with him, I was like, you crazy. Yeah. Like 2000 or something, 2000 podcasts. Like, what? Are you out of your mind?
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, long story short, now more than 3.5 years later, we're still going. We've been doing different types of things to kind of increase the viability of Sports History Network. Do we want to make it a lot bigger as we go? Yeah, because I want to be able to let more people learn about the podcasters on our network. And that's kind of, I guess, the origin story in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think if you enjoy talking sports, this is definitely the venue to go. because you can talk about any sport, about any topic with sports, and it's a chance to just express your opinions, and it's a lot of fun. So if you enjoy all that, podcasting, it can be a really a lot of fun. I look forward to it. So I think you now have 38 podcasts on the network now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but these include my own Total Sports Recall, the Sports Time Traveler, the Football Learning Academy, Gridiron Greats Magazine, When Football Was Football, Pro Football in the 70s, the Pigskin Dispatch, Football Odyssey, among many others. Can you give us the total number of podcasts in the network now, and which ones were among the very first in 2020, which I think you already hit on just before?
Yeah, so that number is kind of like a floating target, because as we bring some on, and then as some of them maybe move on to other things, but when they move on, it's more so maybe they're going to shut their show down. So we may say 38. On my site, we do use a thing called Captivate audio for our podcasting, whatever you want to call it, streaming platform. When I log into my account, there's 38 shows there, but not all 38 of those are some of the ones that you just mentioned. We do have some of the shows that are like affiliate, we call them, where we're just partners. They kind of handle their own podcast what's it called? Like their platform for their hosting services and things. Sports Time Travelers, one of them as an example. The Football Odyssey is another example, where we just want to say, you know what, we're both sports history. We're affiliated. And this is for the listener of the show that says, I already have my own podcast. I don't really want to transition. We do have that like camaraderie, community, where it's not a cannibalization of podcast. Sure. Someone likes, like we'll use Joe Ziemba and Joe Zagorski as an example. Someone likes Joe Ziemba's content. There's a good chance they're also going to like Joe Zagorski's content, because they're both about football history. So naturally speaking, there's some crossovers, and they both don't release one like Joe. Even Darren releasing it every day, you still have enough bandwidth to listen to Darren's episodes and some other guys. But of that, now we don't. I would say, okay, sure, we have about 40 podcasts on the network, but not all of them are what I call active. We only have about 20 active shows. And what that means is somebody that's released an episode within the past month. But the beauty of Sports History Network and their content, so I'm going to use an example of Dayton Triangles podcast that we have on there. Those are episodes that he put on YouTube. I think he said like 10 years ago or something like that. Wow. He converted them into audio, but because it's evergreen content, the Dayton Triangle season that happened back in like 1920 and 21, which by the way, Triangle Park, Dayton Triangles is where the first ever NFL game was played, for those of you that want a little bit of bar knowledge when you go to next trivia night. But he just is like, you know what, I'm going to put it on the network. We just kind of host it for him, cover everything. And then from there, people can still listen to his show via a different platform that he already had it. So we do have a lot of everything on the network's evergreen content, because it's sports history. So the ones that are releasing actively, we have about 20 that are within, releasing at least monthly.
So any success stories that you've gotten that since 2020 from any of your podcasters that you've been made aware of?
Oh, I mean, there's all sorts of different ones. As far as, being recognized, Joe Ziemba gets more gigs as far as being on like a speaking tour for his book. That's one thing that's very beneficial. I think for those of you that are listening and you're like, I already have a book, I want to find ways to promote it more. I've had other people on the network that say that are authors and already are published. People found my book through listening to my podcast, and vice versa, of course, too. They are, the book members, and then they look more up on the person and they found their podcast. But that's one thing that's very beneficial. I would say of all of it, not talking about download numbers, not talking about audience listeners or any of that stuff. It's the camaraderie and the community that our network has helped create. They've created friendships within the organization or within the network, and now they're always communicating about other things. And then if they want to go and grab some, I don't know, we'll just use this as an example, the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Like, we can send people essentially, like we're almost like a shoe-in to send someone to the Pro Football Hall of Fame with press passes every year, because we have this network, have some clout, or any other, like we've sent somebody to the Baseball Hall of Fame for their, I know the one guy, he was Hello Old Sports, he was Big Poppy, like when he went into the Hall of Fame that year. So like, if we want to, that's one thing that like a network allows us to do, as opposed to just individual podcasts. It has a little more clout, even if I reach out to say an author that someone wants on their show to be able to say, hey, as a network, we have this podcaster that has this content, and we think you'll be a good fit. So that was one, individual successes. It's probably been more so being able to meet people they never thought they would before, being able to have opportunities open to being on other shows. We have some guys that because of this, now they're on perhaps like a little short, like Josiamba, the Arizona Cardinals segment, things like that. He may have done that before anyways, but all that does is it gives them a platform and a, I guess you say portfolio to create and go from there.
Yeah, cool. Well, the Sports History Network, and you did it from my own show. You've been submitting some of the podcasts to an annual podcast awards contest. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm actually glad you say it, because that is one thing that I just left out when it comes to like recognition and everything. So the Sports Podcast Awards, somewhere over in England, Great Britain, I don't know what city they're from, but they have it it's an international award show dedicated just for sports podcasts. And before it was, you might be part of like the podcast awards and they have a sports category, or you might be part of like the, what do they call them? The Webbies, I think, is another one that they have. Again, they have podcasts and then sports podcasts from there. They started this organization a few years ago, specifically sports podcasts. Most of them are not history related. They're like the stuff that you might hear nowadays. If you're like a fantasy football podcast listener, you might know the fantasy footballers. There's this rugby guy that I don't know his name, but they're super popular over there, that kind of thing in soccer, or football, depending on where you're from, if you're where you're listening to this. But it's an organization that was intended to bring light, even in the way that they have like their categories and their voting is not intended to just be a popularity contest, because unfortunately that's how most awards period are. It's popularity contest. So they kind of structure it a little bit differently, where you put them in and then you have like a panel that sorts through them to determine here's your finalists. In each category, they may have 5 to 10 finalists for, they have best American football podcast, best basketball podcast, sports documentary. They have like tons of different categories on there. You just go to the Sports Podcast Awards website and you can see all of them, which listener of your show is going to have to go on and vote for some of ours when we get that short list. So then from there, they let people vote on it, but it's still not just a purely voted thing. It's kind of weighted a little bit similar to Hall of Fame, where you have some experts kind of weighing in, but then you also have some popularity. So it's like kind of closer to the older version of like the pro football Pro Bowlers. And now it's just like all the voting and stuff. And we get recognition as far as the network goes, because I want to tap Rick Loaiza on the shoulder and give him some props, because the first ever inaugural Sports Podcast Awards, his show is Basketball History 101, and that's by Rick Loaiza. Very good show, one of our more popular shows on the network. His is just strictly him on a mic, like basically reading almost through a script, and it's almost like you're listening to an audiobook. Again, very well produced, very informative, and all that kind of thing. But he won the basketball category in the inaugural podcast awards. We had a couple others that were in what they call their short list, but Joe Ziemba's one of them. And then I think Truly the Goats might've made that year, and I'm getting years mixed up, but for sure he actually won that category. And we're talking about, I don't remember the guy's name, but there was a former Lakers player that had his own podcast. He beat him out. He beat out like this. Yeah. Like there's some pretty big names in that list, but because his was unique and they liked it, he got enough votes. And it's not like he had, we at the Sports History Network, none of us have ESPN numbers. That's not what we're about. We're a small niche and we're trying to hit you with it. And even though we have small numbers, he still won that award. And then they put I got the photos. They put his logo up on like billboards, on highways, like, hey, Sports Podcast Award winner 2021, I think it would have been at that time. But yeah, so he got some cool recognition over there and everything like that. And then they had like a big awards. It was all streamed online, because it was during still part of COVID and everything like that. So they had this thing, and then he got to actually give an announcement, like thank you speech, I guess you could say, and it was one of those kind of neat moments for him. So that was probably now that you mentioned that was probably our biggest win, air quotes, for the Sports History Network. And then the next year, 2022, we had 4 or 5 on the short list. We didn't unfortunately take home the gold that year, but we had most of them, up in like the silver and bronze, if you want to call it like the Olympic style. This year, we're putting in, the majority of our shows, the ones that are active, we're putting us, we have them put in the different categories. Like, so for instance, I'll go back to Josiemba because he's a prime example. They have one for best team, best American football, then also sports documentary. So we have most of our shows in like 3 categories. Yours, I think, is in sports documentary and maybe talk. Is that what I told you? It was 2 categories. I think those were the 2 that we put you in for. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe one of us will, again, hopefully, cross fingers, one of us will be on the short list, and then we'll then let all the listeners of the show know, hey, now that we have the voting period open, go help us out, and because it will play a factor in there.
So speaking of the voting period, when does that take place?
I'm gonna let you maybe give some filler words because I don't remember what it was. The ending, I know it's this October 31st. I know this month is when we have to get everything in, and then they do the Okay, right here's the timeline. Okay, so entries open. Okay, entries close October 29th, which Sports History Network's all in there already. And then it says November through December, the industry selects. This is like they have a panel. Think of like a Hall of Fame panel. They go through an advisory board. They go through, they listen to the different content, and they look at it, different things. And then the short list announcement will be December 19th, it says, and that's when it opens to the public for voting. And the voting will go through January 28th. And then they're going to awards announcement on February 1st.
Okay, cool. So we'll have to get listeners for everybody's shows to start voting, I guess.
Yeah, and what we'll probably do is when it gets to that point, I'll probably create a pre-roll commercial, which is, before every episode, and it'll say, hey, we have shows on sports, and then encourage people to go look there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just honored to be in the thing. I mean, regardless of the outcome, I think it's pretty cool that, my show's even been selected to be entered in it. So, anybody that's entered in it, they should be proud of that on its own. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you're part of like these different like big groups that are putting their podcasts up there. I'm just looking through some of the ones from 2022, the winners. So God Bless Football, the Fantasy Footballers, Fantasy Baseball Today is a CBS sports show. So these are like some bigger guys, but then there's some smaller ones here too, like these guys called Defiance that won the best sports documentary. I'm trying to find our show. I know we had. I'm looking at the categories. We got in the top 3 in a couple, but this site, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate it. But we did make a couple, like Josiemba's When Football Was Football, I think made in the top 3 for Best American Football Podcast. And I want to say last year we had the Football History Dude was in the short list for the football. We had like 3 in the football podcast category alone. I do remember that. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, while the Sports History Network encompasses many sports, for yourself, I think it's kind of obvious you're football first. But is that your favorite personal sport, and do you follow others?
So, this is one of those scenarios where, growing up, my favorite to play was probably basketball. The one that I was the best at, that I almost had like possibility to go to college, was baseball. Really? And then the one that I've grown to really more fond of the most, and because of my dad and my grandpa, that football is by far, like right now, I really don't follow the other sports that much. Far and away the NFL, and I don't even follow college. Like I think Michigan's ranked right now pretty high, and like I think even Michigan and Michigan State are playing today, and like to me it's like
no kidding.
Whatever. Like that's how much I don't follow it, and not that I don't like watching it. It's just I have to put only bandwidth into certain things, otherwise, especially because the network and that. What was the other question as far as what do I
other sports?
Yeah,
is football.
Football is the only one I follow. Do I like watch? I like watching any sport, like anything that's on that's competitive, especially if it's like a team building, or even if it's a one-on-one like tennis. Is like it's unique to see the dance back and forth. I don't understand like this love and 15-0. Like why is it not 1-2? I don't understand any of that stuff. But I just any kind of competition I do enjoy. Yes.
Yeah. I've been following all sports since I was 12 years old in 1972. So, I mean, I've even watched tennis. They used to have I'm sure you haven't heard of it, but they used to have a professional tennis league. And the Pittsburgh had a team in it called Pittsburgh Triangles. And I think Ken Rosewall, who was a very good tennis player, was the coach of the team. And it was like competitive matches, but in a team environment. It was pretty cool. So, and then, getting away from what you were talking about, but used to be a big, I still am, boxing fan, and then I started following MMA and UFC, but I've curtailed my interest in UFC because they're making it a circus sideshow. But they've, even here in Jacksonville this weekend, they're having bare knuckle boxing, which is crazy. So that's all the rage now. They've created a bare knuckle boxing again, and they really don't go bare knuckle. There's just like a real thin covering over their knuckles, but it's still basically bare knuckle. It's bloody. It's a dumb sport, but it's coming here to Jacksonville this weekend. So yeah, I follow quite a few different sports, and I like to try to treat my show to cover as many different topic sports that people normally don't talk about. Most of it talks about football, baseball, basketball, hockey, but like I was telling you before, there's going to be possibly a golf topic on here. Soccer's coming up in November, so it should be pretty cool.
I'm actually, that's something on the Sports History Network too. And as your listeners are listening to this and they want to start a show, we really want more non-football stuff on the show or the network. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. The reason why it's so heavily geared towards football at the moment is because, like a lot of my guests a lot of it was my guests. I would talk to them on my show, which was a Football History Dude, and I would say, hey, you're really good at this. Would you ever consider starting a podcast? And then it turned into they started their own show. So it really does lean heavily towards, like, we're not intended to say I almost started the network almost was called the Football History Network, but I didn't want to like pigeonhole us to that. My intent was the listener of the show might come in from my podcast and they're also possibly interested in basketball, but I didn't realize there was a basketball history 101 or something like that. So I think that was part of the reason for the ecosystem of the Sports History Network.
Sure. And when I have schedules of interviews, but when those start slowing down and the ones I've booked are over with, yeah, I do want to get back to what my main passion is, and that's sports history. So I'm a history buff, and so hopefully there'll be a few episodes coming up on some topic that has to do with sports history, and that will go tie in with the name of the network. All those interviews, those are all sports history. You're talking about stories. Yeah, I mean, sure. I fully believe that's sports history. Sure, absolutely. I mean, when Craig Colquitt was on, and he had some funny stories to tell, and I was telling you before we started the show that he came to the Steelers, and he's a punter, and they were trying to find him a helmet to use, and all they had around was Terry Hanratty's old helmet with a single bar. And he made a comment. He's like, I've never worn a single bar. He says, I'm telling you, every time I got hit in the head, it felt like my brain was rattling. It was so unprotected, especially compared to the helmets they wear today. I mean, today, it's just, we still have this rash of concussions, but it's kind of hard to believe they're even happening with the helmets they've got there and the safety measures they try to take. But talking about football, I know you're a big Detroit Lions fan. You made that quite clear. What do you make of their success so far this year? I mean, they're doing really well.
The difference now, first off, yes, I'm big. I got my Lions cup here. I got my Barry Sanders coaster never too far from me. I never have pretty much a day where I'm not wearing some kind of Lions logo. But the first thing as far as making success is, you're always hesitant as a fan of a team that has never really won anything. But at the same time, when you said and you opened it up how I drink the blue Kool-Aid, Lions fans are known to drink the blue Kool-Aid and get really excited at the beginning of every season, even if it seems like we're not going to have a good season. But this is the first time with what I foresee as genuine sustained success with the way that they built the roster and the way that they built the culture and just how they've been going about it. It was sketchy for a little bit there where Campbell seemed to not be ready for the big game as far as making big boy decisions in critical moments. But no, I think they've improved that. Of course, there's going to always be some boneheaded mistakes, but even the Belichicks of the world, you look at them, you're like, what are you doing there? And I really do. I feel like the way that they built the culture, the way that everybody bought in, it's a game of inches. We all know this. And the game of inches can also be in the motivation factor that the players have to want to fight for that coach and fight for the team and for each other. And that's the thing I see different now than I have seen just from watching the games. And this is a cliche. I mean, I'm giving no answer that anybody else wouldn't for their team when they improve, but it's different. I asked my dad actually, and people at work, because I don't recall the 91 season. I was 6 years old when that occurred. I would have actually not even been 6 years at the time. Mm-hmm. I kind of remembered it, but I just said, is this what it felt like in 91? I mean, because I haven't really had this feeling in most of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I heard something on the radio yesterday. I was listening to a local sports broadcast on the radio, and they were talking about this weekend's matchup, Detroit and Baltimore. And one of the guys said to the other one, and he's like, well, if you had to choose one of these two teams, who's most likely to go to the Super Bowl this year between these two teams? And they almost unanimously said Detroit. Several guys on the show. So I don't know if that's a premonition. For your sake, hopefully it will be. But there's some top teams.
Well, I think that's a combination.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably a combination of both. Baltimore is maybe not quite as to the level of they are, but also the AFC, in theory, everyone believes is like harder to run through that gauntlet that is the NFC.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the NFC, I think Detroit's playing really well, but San Francisco, Philadelphia, I mean, outside of those two teams, the competition drops. But over in the AFC, Miami seems to be the hot team, but, Kansas City's always there, and Buffalo is questionable. So it's going to be an interesting finish to the season. Of course, my Steelers, I don't know. We'll see what happens. Their offense is pathetic. We're expecting a big turnaround tomorrow. See if they figured things out. We got a bunch of starters coming back. So hopefully, I really thought the Steelers were going to be way better than they were this year. And there's still potential for that. I mean, their defense is amazing. TJ Watt's just Superman. I mean, he's unbelievable.
I'm hoping this, too, that the Steelers do make a comeback on offense. I want them to push Stafford because in multiple fantasy leagues, I'm relying on some of those Rams guys.
Yeah, I actually, my company has a fantasy football league. I'm in second place right now. Last year, I did terrible. But this year, I missed last year's draft. And so they just randomly give you players when you don't take part in the draft. So this year I said, I am going to be at that draft. So I got home late from somewhere and I missed the first two picks, but ended up with Brown, the wide receiver from Philadelphia, and Travis Kelce were my first two picks. I said, okay, that works out.
Yeah, that worked out.
Yeah. So then I started selecting, but I took Kenny Pickett as quarterback. I just added Deontay Johnson because he's off the injured list. And George Pickens, I had to take him because he's phenomenal. And a bunch of other Steelers, including the kicker. So it's worked out for me. But I know how that fantasy football works. And so I used to never like it because I used to talk to a friend of mine. He was big in fantasy football. And I said, I don't like it because then you end up playing fantasy football and you're picking guys that aren't on your team and you end up cheering for another team. And I said, I can't do that.
Well, that gives me an opportunity for a shameless plug for one of our partners and sponsors, Tailgate Fantasy. That kind of gets around that. So the whole purpose of Tailgate Fantasy is you just pick one team that you like and you're going to have them the whole year, and you get to just pick three different players. It's super simple, easy. That's the Sports History Network's listener league right now. You just go to Tailgate Fantasy. Oh, no, actually, to make it easier for the listener to the show, sportshistorynetwork.com/tailgate, and it'll take you right there. You'll learn more about it and go from there. But yeah, they're a partner of the Sports History Network.
Well, as a Steelers fan and you being a Lions fan, you may or may not have heard of this story, but got to bring it up. In 1958, Hall of Fame quarterback Bobby Lane had called signals for the Detroit Lions, 2 championship teams for them, and he was traded to Pittsburgh. This is 1958. It's still unproven because his words were never recorded, but according to teammates and legend, he was angry at being traded. So what Bobby Lane said publicly was the Lions will never win another championship for the next 50 years. So following the trade, they finished that 1958 season with a record of 4-7. They made the playoffs since that year, but Detroit is still without another league title, winning their last one with Lane at the helm in 1957. So now we're in year 66, and Detroit is just one of 3 teams that have yet to reach the Super Bowl, joining Cleveland and Houston. And what do you make of all that? And will Detroit ever see the Super Bowl as one of the 2 teams playing in it?
So, well, first, yes, of course we're going to make Super Bowl. I drink the blue Kool-Aid. We talked about that at the beginning of the episode. Second, when I went, so I moved, I don't know why I wasn't even thinking about this, but when I lived in Dallas for a hot minute, I went to the high school where Bobby Lane played.
Oh, no.
Where, because, and this was within the first day I was there, because I had to take a picture. It also happens to be the high school that Matthew Stafford played for. And I had to take a picture on the field with my Stafford jersey. But the other thing is, I don't know if it's more of the Bobby Lane curse or if it's the John F. Kennedy curse. And I don't know if you've heard of this one.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so the day that the Ford, he actually made the transaction of buying, in the Ford family, we always joke they care more about selling cars than they do the team. But the day that they bought the Ford actually signed the paperwork to buy the team happened to be the same day that JFK was shot.
Oh, no kidding.
So was there something going on there? Because there's the joke that JFK there's the Lions. He's only missed one playoff game victory since for the Lions, which was 91. Do I believe in curses? No. Do I believe in bad ownership? Yeah. Do I believe in bad organizations that only care about making sales on their cars and having the logo on the stadium as opposed to putting any kind of football people in charge? And it's funny how when you actually go back and you get Spielman, Barry Sanders back involved, and then you let Spielman kind of run the show as opposed to a family that doesn't know anything about football, Jerry Jones. And then you actually have a team that knows what they're, an organization that puts football people in charge. And now it seems like now they're having a team. I think I believe more in that than I do a curse.
Sure. And that's funny. That might be a good topic for another show, is curses in sports. Because Chicago Cubs are famous for the Billy Goat curse. And we could talk about that another day. Or
the Bambino or whatever. And
yeah, because long story short, Chicago Cubs, this guy brought his pet goat to the game, and they told him he was not allowed to have the goat in the stadium and to have it removed. And after that, the Cubs just went on this monstrous losing streak. So they call it the Billy Goat curse.
I never heard of that one.
Yeah, you have to look that one up. It's hilarious.
I think that would be a great episode. Yeah, and you could get other members on the network to bring their own curses and that people have never heard. I think that'd be a cool crossover event.
Absolutely, because there's plenty of them. I mean, definitely there's plenty of curses that go on in sports.
I mean, there's the Madden curse that everyone talks about. This stuff. Now, I heard someone recently joking about the Subway curse because Russell Wilson, once he started doing the Subway commercials, he just really tanked it.
I've never heard that one, but the Madden curse, definitely. There's something to that. You would think anyway, because it has happened so often that whoever's on the cover ends up getting injured the following season.
Oh, that or they retire. My guy, Barry Sanders, he was supposed to be on the cover the next year, and then he decides to retire. We don't want to bring up bad memories, I guess.
Well, that's funny you bring up Barry Sanders, because that was going to be my next question. As a Lions fan, who is your favorite player of all time? Without being biased, this second part of this question, and before we get to it, I honestly believe that Barry Sanders, I wish he would have played longer, because in my mind, he's and Walter Payton are the two best running backs ever, without question. I mean, Barry Sanders was so much fun to watch because he was so elusive, and Peyton elusive, but at the same time powerful. But without being biased, Emmitt Smith's the all-time leading rusher. Who's the better running back, Emmitt Smith or Barry Sanders?
I think, well, first off, I did tell you earlier I got the Barry Sanders coaster never too far from my hand. I was going to grow up as a kid, in Michigan watching. I didn't know anything but Barry Sanders because he was drafted 89. I was born in 85. So I didn't remember anything but Barry Sanders being on the team. And when you're at the stadium, the Silverdome, this is the old place the Lions played in Pontiac. If you go back and watch the old videos, you'll hear the whole stadium just chanting. It's not "Go Lions," it's "Barry, Barry." Wow. Oh, I'm getting chills and I'm probably getting goosebumps all over. My hair is raised. Look, I don't know if you can see it. My hair is raised up just when I said that. And I can't wait till this documentary that comes out. So I am in no position ever to give a non-biased opinion on Barry Sanders versus Emmitt Smith, but I will try. So from a talent level, a athletic, obscure, unique positional player of all time, Barry Sanders is hands down, I think, better than Emmitt Smith. Again, I can't be unbiased. I will make that clear. From a football positional roster piece, I could see how in the right position, Emmitt Smith is definitely better. So I was trying to think about this when you asked me the question. I could see in the Kyle Shanahan, I'm going to bring it to a modern day system. Kyle Shanahan, which of course was from, Father Mike Shanahan. So in the Shanahan system, I could see how Emmitt Smith would be the better player to have on that team because he was more of vision, patience, one cut, go, balance, all that type of stuff. Where Barry's more of like I'm going to run around. And was it a product of because his team was so bad, he always had to just make it up? Or would he have been able to actually hit the hole? DeAndre Swift in a current modern NFL is a perfect prime example. With the Lions, he just, for whatever reason, he couldn't find that hole to hit and go on a consistent basis. Now with the Eagles, it's like they just did something. He's doing something different with them. So he just wasn't a good fit. So I always look at that as the greatest of all time. And I think that's one of those near impossible challenges because sweetness, Walter Payton, like he might have been the better player to have on anybody's roster, even though Barry Sanders talent wise might have been better from, like you said, his shiftiness. It's just to give you an unbiased opinion, best player. Yes, Barry Sanders was the better running back, but teammate, I don't know. It might have been Emmitt Smith. If you want to win championship, I still could argue probably that from a non-biased, Emmitt Smith might have been in the right position, the best player to have on the roster or the field at that time.
Well, I think Barry Sanders was Oklahoma State, right?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, okay. Oklahoma State, because I remember watching him in college. I was like, holy crap, who is this guy? My God, he's phenomenal. He was like running through, paper, him. He just was an incredible runner. But it's interesting because I had one of my interviews last weekend. We were talking about the same subject. And this guy I interviewed was a high school football player where I went. He went to Calvary, University of Pennsylvania, very successful there. But we were talking about this same topic and talking about Emmitt Smith. I said, well, he was behind such a massive offensive line. It was almost impossible for him not to get yards. And the comment from my guest was, well, could you imagine Barry Sanders behind that line? Now, I think if Barry Sanders would have played out his career as far as it could go, he would have set the all-time record beyond anybody ever breaking it. I think he would have set the bar so high, Emmitt Smith would have never touched it. But he only played 10 seasons, I think, Barry Sanders?
I want to say, for some reason, I want to say 9. I know it was 1,000 yards every time. Like, he holds the record for the most, I mean, like, the most yards. Whatever it was significantly less than Emmitt, though.
Yeah, and styles make everything, and they are of different style. All these guys are, but I can tell you, as a power runner, nobody touches Jim Brown. I mean, that guy, and he's another one that retired way early. If he'd have continued playing, he would have thousands of more yards, but this dude was averaging like 100 yards a game every game. He was just phenomenal. It's like a freight train running through the line, and he was almost impossible to bring down.
He had to deal with stuff that the players in the NFL do not have to deal with now because of the color of his skin. Exactly. And everybody trying to come after him at the bottom of the pile, being kicked, poked in his eye, all this stuff. So I think what he did was more impressive than any other running back that we were going to talk about. Necessarily, we can go way back to the old school, running backs. But I think Jim Brown's career was more impressive than even I have to admit, more than Barry Sanders even.
Yeah, and I don't know who would want to kick that dude because he was mean. I mean, he was a mean son of a bitch. And so, it's not somebody you would want to mess with or meet in a dark alley on the street. Absolutely. And unfortunately, he passed away this year. So, but he lived a good long life, and he became a movie actor after that. And I think that's why he quit football.
When I saw 2019, I think it was, I'm at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and there were a bunch of people kind of hovering around this location right before, like, where they have the Ralph Hay, like the research center. My dad and I stopped just trying to figure out what's going on here. There was a car, and they pulled up, they opened it up. Out comes Jim Brown. I recognized who he was, of course, because, even if you're not a fan from that era.
Yeah.
And I saw so many people, and again, I'm starting to tear up and cry, but I saw all these grown men crying and cheering him on. And most of them even were talking that had nothing to do with his football playing. It was all to do with what he gave to society and trying to put for equal rights and all this stuff. But that right there in that moment, I realized what he meant to people and to the world. Beyond the game of the gridiron, beyond football. He was a dude that had more impact probably than mostly, and he used his fame and fan or whatever for good. So I keep rambling, but I just, that you made me think about that moment, and I'm getting a little emotional about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same for Walter Payton, superhuman being, and a caring human being. And his loss was a real tragedy. I mean, that was just a sad, sad, sad day when he got sick and passed on. But phenomenal athlete there. So let me ask you what your goals are now for the Sports History Network, and do you have any expectations you would like to meet?
So the overarching, pie in the sky goal that has no true goal value to it to be a SMART goal is we want to become the headquarters for sports yesteryear, meaning essentially we want to be comparable to, people think of those four letters ESPN as far as like the global network for sports. I would like to see Sports History Network, and there's many different avenues for that, but I would like to see us become SHN, synonymous with ESPN from the sports history realm. People across the world know about it, and they know that they can trust the Sports History Network to come in and provide them with entertaining value, sports history that's accurate, stuff that they can find new content they hadn't learned about before, which kind of leads me into the I don't know if we want to say success or goals or whatever, but that's part of what it is. It's creating not just the headquarters of Sports History, but we have two different customers from the Sports History Network side. So we have the podcaster, and we want to be able to provide them with tools, resources, and I use the joke or whatever you want to call it, the analogy of helping them fill their own stadiums with fans, air quotes, listeners, because we have different shared resources. And then for the listener, we want it to be able to come into this stadium and not only watch that game, listen to the podcast and learn about something entertaining. And they also are able to learn something fresh that they've never heard before. But then they can walk out of that stadium and right down the street. Okay, in Detroit, we have Comerica and we have all the stadiums right next to each other. They could walk into a new stadium, air quotes, podcast and learn about a whole nother sport that maybe opens their eyes, that then they can perhaps become a fan of that sport, or they can, just learn something else. Like that's the goal, is creating this, I don't want to say ecosystem, but like this synergistic relationship between the listeners and the podcasters, but then also cross-referencing through sports and time.
Sure. And I think the array of different sports that you have on your network is a very good thing, because, you could turn your radio on and listen to football, and that's all they're talking about right now, or the World Series coming up. Hockey's underway and NBA is getting started. And those are the 4 or 5 major sports that you're going to hear on the radio, and that's all you're going to hear. So you can turn to the Sports History Network, and you might be interested in a different kind of sport or a different story or some history, and you'll be able to find it on the Sports History Network, which is a really cool thing.
We even have stuff talking about Flama the Great. And so he's the greatest gladiator from like the Roman era of all time. Like you think that you have this unbeatable Otto Graham, 10 championships in 10 years. And, he's got these great stats. No, Flama the Great, man, he was the dude. He earned his chance to be like, if you ever watched the Russell Crowe movie where you can earn your chance to get out of the, you're not a gladiator anymore, earn your freedom. He had a chance like 3 different times, but he just was so dominant. He kept going back. So he was like, that era is like, I don't know. Think of the most, the famous LeBron James, whoever's the most famous athlete right now. That was Flama the Great.
I'm going to have to look that up.
Truly the GOATs. That's the podcast.
That's good. Well, Arnie, once again, I would like to thank you for the support of this show and all the assistance you provided in making this a successful podcast. You're more than welcome to come back at any time as a guest, and as I do with everyone that appears on the show, I give you the opportunity for any parting words.
So I would say if you're someone that's interested in starting a podcast, because that's how we started this whole show or episode, entertain the idea. Don't sit back and think that you are not going to be interesting. You're not someone that has, the imposter syndrome. No one's going to listen to your voice and all that thing. If you're interested, reach out to the Sports History Network. We have a contact page. It goes right to my inbox. I will reach back out to you. We'll have a conversation. Even if you don't want to start a podcast, you want to write an article for us or whatever it may be, I think diving into history through the avenue of sports really helps us understand where we came from, and then we can be able to share that message with the masses, air quotes, because we want to fill the stadiums and everything. So again, if you're interested, reach out to us at sportshistorynetwork.com/contact. But if you just go right to sportshistorynetwork.com, you're going to have the contact icon right at the top on the menu.
All right. Well, folks, that's a wrap on yet another episode of the Total Sports Recall podcast. And as always, next weekend brings another episode. To be sure to keep checking my Twitter page for announcements of shows and updates to my website, which you can find at totalsportsrecall.com. You may reach out to me by email at the address of totalsportsrecall@gmail.com. I also have a YouTube channel by the same name, Total Sports Recall. Or you can give me a shout out on Twitter using my handle at TSRHarv59. For Arnie Chapman, this is Harv Aronson wishing everyone a wonderful week ahead.
The contents of this podcast does not represent the opinions of others and is solely the opinions of Harv Aronson based on his experience, knowledge, and research.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, aka the Football History Dude, and I wanted to thank you for stopping by to listen to another episode here on the Sports History Network. Our podcasters are passionate about uncovering and sharing sports stories from yesteryear. And if you didn't know it already, we have over 30 shows across the network covering all sorts of sports history topics. In fact, here's a glimpse into one of our awesome podcasts here on the network.
Hello, football friends. This is Darren Hayes of the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, and I'd like to invite you to the portal of positive football history, Pigskin Dispatch and pigskindispatch.com. We talk about everything that centers around the game of American football, expert discussions, the origins of the games, the great players, teams, and coaches, and more, and some great guests and insights from experts. We have new episodes 3 to 4 times a week, and you can find us on sportshistorynetwork.com, pigskindispatch.com, or your favorite podcast provider.
How about that? I bet you're super hyped to go listen to that new podcast, right? Well, to learn about this show and all the other podcasts on the network, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Head over there today to find your next favorite sports history podcast.